Want a beautiful vegetable or forest garden but don't know where to start? This video is for you. I've just started a new forest garden project here, and I'm going to take advantage of this launch to show you all the steps that I think are important for getting started the right way. So a lot of you have asked me questions about management, maintenance, planting guilds or perennial vegetables. I'll answer all your questions, but since there are many, it will take a few videos. If you have more, ask in the comments. I'll use your questions to build this video series. Now, to start the tour, I'll share how this project began. I'll start with a quick update. We're in Marsac-sur-Tarn, right next to Albi, in the middle of a large agricultural area. The land is 6,000 square meters, so we're clearly not starting with a huge project, which is perfectly fine with me right now. And actually 6,000 square meters doesn't stop us from having big ambitions, like for example creating a nursery here. And even, why not make enough for 2 salaries? Well, the future will tell us if that's possible. Carol bought this land a few years ago, and when she bought it, it was completely overgrown. Apparently, a long time ago, an old man owned this land and had already made his vegetable garden here. But since then, he abandoned it. And so, since then, it got covered with blackthorn, brambles, and especially plum trees, Mirabelle plums. Mirabelle plums are commonly used by nurserymen as rootstock for most stone fruit trees. It's actually great then. Carol has had this land for a little while, but she started working on it 3 years ago. 3 years ago, she cleared a small glade in the wasteland to create a vegetable garden. 2 years ago, she expanded her vegetable garden, and bam, I've joined the project, and we've decided to make it a forest garden and nursery. So, if I try to sum up the story of this plot, originally an agricultural area, then an old man came to make his vegetable garden here, then the garden was abandoned and it became wild again. The area seems like young woodland, not a forest, just a small wood. We first cleared the wood. Carol did this to make a vegetable area, then we turned it into a forest garden. There you go, there was quite a bit of back and forth. It's been a long time since this small plot has been influenced by agriculture or related activities. So that's already pretty good. This video series will show you the steps we'll take to turn this land and these vegetable gardens into a forest garden. But before that, we'll still look at the few steps that happened before to see how we were going to go about it. I'll use this chance to answer your great questions. Some of you asked how this project began and what I started with, so we actually began with an old wasteland. Flo, you asked me what my biggest constraints were. There were several, but the main challenge was transforming this wasteland into cultivable soil. There were many stumps, roots and blackthorns to remove, so it was pretty complicated. Compared to my former forest garden in Vaur, where I started from an old meadow, let's say that one of the first steps when it comes to planting itself starting from an old meadow is still much simpler. Also, with sandy soil like I had in Vaur, it's much simpler than on an old wasteland or an old forest where there are a lot of roots. Just clearing it so you can start some vegetable crops. Honestly, we didn't remove all the roots from the entire area, only the growing areas were uprooted and cleared, while around them we just cut at the base. There are still many stumps, or souquettes as we call them, and dealing with them is already tiring enough. We remove them from the growing areas, but if they don't get in the way, we leave them, we cut them as short as possible so they don't bother us, and that's enough. On the other hand, there's a major advantage. Although it's a wasteland, we're still in a large agricultural area. I'll talk to you about it again very soon. So we're still on soil that's very fertile to begin with, and on top of that, since it was a forest, a fallow just before, we have soil that's become even richer in organic matter, so we're starting with a very fertile base. And I think that in terms of production, it will be much more interesting here than it was on my previous project. Now, how do I get out? The soil here is fertile. How do you know if your soil is fertile? We didn't do a lab here, and I don't think it's needed. Unless you're doing large-scale monoculture with just one plant and you need to know exactly what's in your soil. We're discussing both a diversified vegetable garden and a forest garden, regardless of fertility. The goal is to understand your soil's texture, to know how to work with it and improve fertility. That's a separate topic for later. For now, to understand my soil's texture, we did the jar test. With this jar test, we found our soil was very silty and sandy, so there you go. With a very fertile potential, but also with the possibility of having a soil that compacts and quickly becomes waterlogged. So there you go, we'll have to pay attention to that. But in any case, the fact that it's rich in silt already indicates that we'll be able to have a very fertile soil. Silty soils are the most cultivated in agriculture for good reason. Doing the jar test isn't a full lab test, but it still takes some knowledge. There's another way to know if your soil is fertile, which is even simpler. And here you just need to take a step back and see what's around. Once again, if we look around our garden, we're in the middle of a vast agricultural area, which doesn't have only advantages. I'll mention it again, but it already proves the soil is fertile. Otherwise, agriculture wouldn't exist here. Compared to my last project in Bauer, I was surrounded by forests there. If these aren't agricultural areas, there's a reason. Here, it's agricultural, so it must be fertile. If you wanted to start a new project and asked me for the best choice, what would it be? Being surrounded by agricultural, forest, or other areas? Well, the answer will always be the same. It depends. It will depend on your different goals, your constraints, your limits, and your resources. In reality, we usually have little choice, so we make do and adapt. In our case, it's surrounded by agricultural areas, so it's very fertile. That's great. On the other hand, there are some disadvantages, and there are quite a few. It's going to be related to biodiversity, since the crops we have around are treated, all that in terms of biodiversity. There's not much that lives in there, or at least less than in a wild area. It could also be about the noise level, similar to today. The farmer plows his field, so when the tractor passes, it's not easy, but that's not a big deal since it doesn't happen daily. Another major real constraint is that we're completely surrounded in the middle of farmland. The landowner gives us access, which is already an obligation. In France, you must allow a right of way, but the issue is if we ever want to expand, that's it. It wouldn't be easy to get more land from these surrounding plots or even to buy pieces of land. We're small, we want to stay small, and in this context it's usually the big ones who win, so that's that. That could become a big constraint in the future. And that's actually why these kinds of small projects surrounded by big agricultural projects sometimes don't last very long. Anyway, I'm getting off track. Let's get back to how to know your soil. Since there's agriculture around, we know it's fertile. There's another method. Jay, some of you asked this question. Did I use bioindicator plants? Can we use bioindicator plants to understand our soil? So yes, just so you know, I didn't do an in-depth, complete analysis here using bioindicator plants, which could have given me a very concrete understanding of the soil. But on the other hand, I still observed in general what was growing around, mainly to see if there were any problems with extreme conditions. That means it's too acidic, calcareous, dry, or otherwise difficult to cultivate. If that were true, agriculture wouldn't exist. We'll revisit this. Well, that being said, I checked no chestnut trees or ferns that would indicate a soil that's too acidic, no plants, I can't remember them right now, but that would indicate soils that are too calcareous. For those who asked about clay limestone soil, that's not my situation, so I won't address it now, but it could be covered in another video. So regarding bioindicator plants, there aren't really any plants here that indicate problematic soils, so it should work out. And the other thing I quickly noticed is that we're on land that's covered with a few blackthorns, a lot of brambles, and a huge number of cherry plums. And what does that indicate? Well, that means here we're going to have a blast growing lots of prunus, plum trees, apricot trees, cherry trees, and even hybrids between all these species. The fruits are excellent. For those interested, we'll have some for sale at the nursery soon, but that's another topic. Let's continue. We've shown our soil can be fertile and we've cleared former wasteland in some areas. And now we'll see what steps to take to know how to start and organize to set up your garden. So first of all, what you'll need to do before anything else is observe and record data about the weather, the climate, the wind, the temperatures, and the rainfall. Look at the areas where water flows, see the spots with shade and sunlight, all of that for at least a year. And then use all that data to create a plan, a design, a layout to work from. It's important to define areas by usage frequency and then set up different planting zones. And don't forget in these plantings to have plants for each different layer. So that's maybe what I would say if I had just finished a permaculture course and had no real field experience. The way I had nothing to do with it, sorry, so the way we started here. And so, just to be clear, I'm not telling you that's what you should do, I'm just saying that's how we started, that's how we began, and today, that's how I find it most interesting to start. What we began to do, and actually it's more what Carol started to do. First, clear a spot in the center of the wasteland, then start planting vegetable crops. A small area that's a bit of a fun garden. We built a hut, there's an igloo and some willow for the kids, that's it. Alongside that, as we continue planting, observe, identify what works or doesn't, and determine why something isn't growing. Through experience, identify areas that are harder to cultivate. So, if I had to give advice but still related to permaculture, it would be to start small but make a small vegetable garden, plant a guild, a fruit area, anything, but plant. And alongside that, observe what happens with the crops you set up. This lets you identify areas suitable for growing and those less ideal for cultivation. It's too dry, sunny, shady or cold. But it's through experience that you'll see what works or doesn't work, rather than just by observing a bare plot of land or a plot that you haven't cultivated yet. And also by doing this, you'll gain experience, especially in terms of observation. And by noting what works and what doesn't, just from the simple act of already cultivating plants. I really want to emphasize this way of doing things. I'm not saying it's the best for everyone, but in any case, it's the most suitable for people like me who have a hyperactive temperament. And I like to take action right away and use the results of my tests and mistakes to keep moving forward and refine my actions for the future. And for me, that's really the idea behind permaculture. It's not just about observing for a year before starting, it's about doing, observing the results and adapting what we'll do next. Thanks to these observations, and always observe, 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 observe. It has to stay that way until the end. Sorry, I got sidetracked. So, by doing and observing, we eventually managed to define a few main areas in the garden, and we're going to look at them. You're probably thinking, it's been over 10 minutes and we haven't started the tour, we've just set the groundwork. In upcoming videos, we'll cover more details. And now, I'm going to show you in general the main areas we've defined on the cleared land, so to speak. For now, there are more or less 2,000 square meters in total. Out of these 2,000 square meters, about 1,000 square meters are currently used as a forest garden. And here, I'm standing at the entrance of this area, so when you enter the garden, on the left, it's one of the first areas that Carol worked on. She started working on it, as I said, I'm not sure if I mentioned it. She began with a small vegetable garden, then created a willow igloo hut for the kids. There you go. And then she quickly realized that in this area, doing and observing once again, she quickly saw that this area wasn't very fertile. It became thirsty quickly. Since things didn't grow well, she moved her first vegetable garden closer to the center. Things improved a bit after that. 2 years ago, she expanded the vegetable garden and we could see a real difference. Well, she clearly saw from the start that the more central areas in the garden were much more fertile. And then, in that case, things grew really well, so she expanded toward that area. I don't recall how she organized her vegetable garden 3 years ago, but 2 years ago she made it more structured. So she organized it into several beds of the same length and arranged them herself into different squares that were more or less the same size. That was practical for quite a few reasons, but especially for irrigation, since for each square there was a water cube. Those cubes, like the one I have right behind me, which are 1 cubic meter. And so, that cubic meter was the amount needed to irrigate that little square. If the well doesn't supply enough water, I won't elaborate further since it's already in a video. I'll put a link somewhere here where Karen was explaining to us about his setup, his garden, and especially his low pressure irrigation system. At that time, it was still the most practical way she found to irrigate her garden. Watch that video to see how the garden looked then. There are already some small trees planted in and around these vegetable areas. Karen built a pond in the middle, and there are some smaller areas where we're still unsure what to do. All of that is nice, but it doesn't make a forest garden yet. Everything I've shown you so far was basically set up by Karen until last year, and since then there's been a big change in the project. I'm the one who showed up and of course wants to add my own personal touch. For better or for worse, we'll see. Overall, there's one big thing that has changed since I've been here, and that's the overall direction of the project. Karen wanted to make his vegetable garden here, and since then we've had other ambitions. We want to create a forest garden, with the main goal for this forest garden to produce resources to supply our farm business, our nursery, with the goal of developing well. Why not earn an extra salary from starting the nursery? By the way, if anyone is interested, I've made quite a few videos. I'll put a video link here, and if you look around a bit, you'll find the others. In this series, we'll focus on creating the forest garden in the upcoming videos. We'll review the steps we took to turn these vegetable gardens into a forest garden. What does it mean to transform into a forest garden, and what is a forest garden? Most importantly, how does this benefit us and our projects? In the upcoming video, arriving soon, we'll focus on fertility and irrigation. You had many questions and you'll notice several changes in irrigation. Since my last video featuring Carol's low pressure irrigation system, and in the next video, we'll mainly talk about crops, how to set them up, what types of crops and combinations. All that. You also had a lot of questions about that. And by the way, if you have any questions about anything, feel free to ask them in the comments, because I use those questions to move this video series forward. Hope you enjoyed the start of this tour. See you soon for the next part. If you enjoyed it, you can let me know in the comments, give it a thumbs up and share the video with others. If you think others might like it, subscribe to the channel. All of that, it always makes me really happy. If you want to support me financially as well, well, that also makes me happy. And it's thanks to that I can keep taking the time to make these videos. There's a link over there to TPLE for those who want to do it and for those who are doing it or will do it. Thanks to you, I can keep going. See you soon for what's next. Goodbye, everyone.